We're here at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. for a discussion on race, ethnicity, and culture. Representatives of religious and civil rights groups will focus on the changing religious landscape in the U.S. and how it impacts the community, workplace, and government. Juan Williams of National Public Radio and Fox News will moderate the 2.5-hour forum. It's hosted by the National Conference for Community and Justice.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sanford Cloud. I am President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Conference for Community and Justice, a human relations organization dedicated to fighting bias, bigotry, and racism, and promoting respect and understanding among all races, religions, and cultures through advocacy, conflict resolution, and education. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the 7th annual conversation on race, ethnicity, culture, and faith in partnership with Aetna. Over the last several years, in honor of Dr. King and on his birthday, we have held what we now are calling the Voice of Conscience, the national conversation of race, ethnicity, and culture. Over the years, we have engaged in a number of important different topics facing our society, with a very diverse set of voices on each occasion, to engage in dialogue, to inform, which we hope will all lead to action by empowering leaders to engage in institutional change that allows for the transformation of communities to make them more whole, more just, and inclusive. Today, we will focus on the role of religion in our ever-growing diverse society. During our time together, you will hear from a broad range of people, of faith and faith leaders and people who are interested in the subject of faith, and you will be able to ask questions of the discussants. Following this event, I want you to know that you are invited by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies to remain for a panel discussion at 4 today here at the National Press Club, entitled America in Transition, Rethinking National Policy Priorities. I also want to make a note of the fact that there are 2 new publications produced by NCCJ that are at your seats: Faith Leaders on Intergroup Relations, Perspectives, and Challenges, and a resource guide of faith-based principles entitled Denouncing Racism, in connection with our Faith Leaders Initiative. On behalf of the National Conference for Community and Justice and Aetna, I want to welcome our esteemed panelist and moderator, Juan Williams. Our panelists include, and I'd like our panelists to raise their hand as I call your name: Professor Diana Eck, Harvard University; Sharifa Alkhateeb, President, Muslim Education Council; Jacqueline L. Johnson, Executive Director, National Congress of American Indians; Imam W. Dean Mohammed, Leader, Muslim American Society; Father Daniel Coughlin, U.S. House of Representatives Chaplain; Dr. Rajwant Singh, Sikh Council on Religion and Education; the Reverend Richard Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals; Bishop Thomas L. Hoyt, Presiding Bishop, the 4th Episcopal District Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and President-elect, the National Council of Churches; Raul Izagata, President, National Council of La Raza; Rabbi Paul Minatoff, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Please welcome our panelists. In a few moments, you will hear from the National Capital NCCJ Board Chair, Beverly Silverberg, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, our distinguished Congresswoman from the District of Columbia, and Juan Williams of the National Public Radio, who will moderate the discussion and take your questions regarding the increasing pluralism of the United States religious landscape and its impact on the community, workplace, and government. At this time, I would like to introduce my dear friend, colleague, and longtime organizational partner in putting on the National Conversation for Race, Ethnicity, and Culture, the president of the Aetna Foundation, Marilda Lara-Gandara.
Thank you, Sandy. On behalf of Aetna, I really have to say that I feel truly privileged to be here today. I often have an opportunity to speak for the company, but some events, I can tell you, are much more special to my heart than others, and this one certainly is an event that's very close to my heart. I came to Aetna 23 years ago as a young lawyer. And for those of you trying to figure out who I am, I was a very young, very precocious lawyer, so don't even try and figure out my age. But I came in part to Aetna, in great part actually I came to Aetna because even then Aetna had a very distinguished history back in 1978 in terms of diversity. I can tell you that I came to a law department that was almost a 100-person department, and a third of it was comprised of women. And in 1978, that was very unusual. Even more unusual, 10% of the Aetna Law Department at that time was made up of people of color, Latinos and African Americans primarily. And that really, as a Latina, attracted me to the company. The second thing that really attracted me to the company was that Aetna had just the most wonderful track record of community activism. And going back to, for example, in the 1880s, our chairman also, while chairman of Aetna for about 35, 40 years, served as governor of the state of Connecticut, served as mayor of the city of Hartford. Voluntarism was declared a key tenet of our company in the 1950s. So it really was a company with an incredible history. It also was a company that had some extraordinary people, and actually Sandy Cloud was one of those people, and I did have an opportunity to work with Sandy in the law department on a number of urban and community projects around the country. And when I took this position 7 years ago, I had had the privilege of attending the first national conversation, which Aetna had been a sponsor of, here in Washington. And I had attended not as president of the foundation, but as an Aetna executive in a different area. And when I took this position, Sandy and I immediately started talking about what can we do with this wonderful concept of the conversation. Having come to this country as a young girl from a country, I am Cuban, and it's a country that has suffered from a number of totalitarian regimes, the Castro one being the latest, and a long-suffering people. I am just so aware of the importance of democracy and how democracy is so connected to conversations. Because what really makes democracy work is that we have in this nation a tradition of listening to each other. And we may not always do it perfectly, but it is the essence of our legal system, and it is our ideal. And in order for us to listen to each other, the reality is that we have to come together. And that is not always easy because we don't always live near each other, socialize together, go to school together. Oftentimes we work together, But that is not a setting where it is easy for us to talk about our differences. And so this has been, I think, a wonderful opportunity for Aetna to continue its work of building our community by focusing on the importance of not only having an opportunity to come together, but also to develop the skill set that is needed for us to talk across our differences. Because it is only by talking to each other that we will come to understand each other and then allow the democratic process to take place. And the reason we accept in our country the political changes, it's because we basically feel that we've had a chance to have our say and that we will have a chance to change the system. And so if my viewpoint doesn't win this time around in the local or the national election, I feel that I have had my opportunity. And if I didn't take it, it was because I didn't want to take it. And so the work that the National Conference is doing is just so important. And I can tell you, having worked with the National Conference around the country, that it is being done very well. And so post-September 11, it really becomes incumbent upon those of us who have been supporting this kind of work and have been engaged in this kind of work to be very thoughtful about how we leverage the wonderful foundation that an organization like NCCJ has laid for us as Americans to talk to each other. And so I really can tell you that this is a work that's close to my heart. It's close to the heart of other people who are here from Aetna, Gwen Houston, our head of diversity, Marilyn Alverio, emerging markets, Elise Wright, who is our executive vice president, human resources, and others. It really is very important to us. It is very much a part of what Aetna not only is today, but has been through its first 150 years. And even before September 11, we have thought about focusing on the religious diversity in America. We have made it a point every year to focus on a different diversity. And so we have focused on, one year we focused, for example, on physical challenges and those that are discriminated upon because they are in a wheelchair or because they are dealing with another type of a physical challenge. The pain is the same when you are discriminated against and when you don't have a job opportunity or other social opportunities because you are physically challenged. One year we focused on gay and lesbian issues. The pain is the same. Whether you are discriminated against or lose your job or are prevented from taking a job because you're African American or gay, the pain is the same. The impact is the same on you and your family. And so this year, I think the Lord had led us. I have to use that term. I think I can use that term today, even though it's a business setting, to think about religious diversity. And so I want to thank Sandy. I want to thank the rest of the staff. I want to thank our panelists, Juan. I want to thank everyone who has just really worked so hard to make this happen. And I guess before I introduce Eleanor Holmes Norton, I just want to say, in my own native language, gracias a todos por venir, bienvenidos, y que Dios nos bendiga en este día y toque nuestros corazones para que seamos hermanos en una manera todavía más cerca uno de los otros. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, District of Columbia, a well-known name in our nation, a beloved figure in many ways in America, a woman who has represented the people of the district for the last 6 years, who raises her voice on behalf of justice for the district in many ways, including statehood. And she has been an important person in helping us to remain calm during the very difficult months that our capital has experienced in the last, since September 11. So it is my second great privilege today to introduce a woman that I really admire, and it is our privilege really to have you here, Eleanor.
Thank you very kindly. May I first commend Aetna for your work with the National Conference. And may I thank the National Conference for continuing the work you began in 1927, opposing bigotry in all its forms. Here you are in Washington for your 7th annual conversation on race, ethnicity, and culture. Perfectly timed for today, the actual birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, many of us dutifully hail King every January, then take the part of his life and his message that relates to us or suits us and leave the rest on the table. But your conference today surely reminds us all that for King, human rights was indivisible. It was all or it was nothing. The panel today offers an opportunity to evaluate whether we are prepared to live by the principles we have ostensibly embraced by the official action of a national holiday honoring Dr. King and his principles. Now remember, before we congratulate ourselves, that it took us nearly 2 centuries to embrace racial and religious equality and harmony as a national ideal. These did not become truly national ideals until the 1960s, when they finally entered our law and our jurisprudence. Today, the country, however, is being tested. Can we translate these principles into appropriate action when faced with specific challenges or events like September the 11th? The way to understand this, I think, is to conceive it as a mathematical rule or principle. Once you've learned the rule, that is hardly enough. The question is, can you apply it to a specific problem? Finally, it has become easy enough for the average American to embrace the general proposition or principle of equality of treatment for all, harmony among groups. You could go out in the streets of Washington, you could not find a single soul that did not say that they embrace that principle. Indeed, you probably couldn't find anybody in the country that would own up to not embracing those principles today. But here's the test. When people living in your own country, many of them, your fellow Americans, look like or come from religious or cultural traditions similar to those who have attacked you in the worst way in your homeland, killed thousands of your own people, how are you prepared to respond? Almost a year ago, I wrote and then introduced a racial profiling bill out of the experience of African Americans throughout the country on the roads of our country, funded by the United States of America. And I gathered a lot of support for this bill and am continuing as I try to have it included in the multi-billion-dollar reauthorization of the federal transportation bill, the T21 bill that we're going to reauthorize next year. But I ask myself, will that bill get the same support it did when I introduced it, as I said, almost a year ago. The problem for African Americans remains intact, and now other groups in our country have been added to this very same concern. I would argue that far from running away from racial profiling today, we have all the more reason to run toward such a bill, since the problem, if anything, has become more pronounced and more people are subject to profiling. This is but one example of what I mean when I say we are being tested. We only know for sure what we believe when we are put to such tests. King was constantly testing himself and his principles. We have absolutely no right to celebrate his birthday unless we are willing, like King, to concede to our own imperfections, and like King, to put ourselves to the test of our stated principles. I have no doubt that your able moderator, Juan Williams, and your distinguished panel will do just that and do it very well this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Norton, for your message. And I'd like to add to all of you that are here today a very warm welcome to Washington, D.C. It's a privilege to have you all with us here in the nation's capital. Now, I've been asked to read a proclamation by the mayor, and we thank the mayor for his proclamation, official seal and everything. Welcome, National Conference for Community and Justice, the Voice of Conscience, the 7th Annual Conversation on Race, Ethnicity, and Culture. As Mayor of the District of Columbia, I am pleased to extend a warm welcome to the National Conference for Community and Justice and Aetna on the occasion of your 7th Annual Conversation. The purpose of this meeting is to conduct informed conversations by people with diverse perspectives about racial and other differences that stimulate others to participate in serious, ongoing dialogue on intergroup relations. I know that the citizens of this great city can look forward to your continued contributions to our city and our nation. Washington, D.C. is a city with a long history of hospitality. I hope you will take the opportunity to visit our famous historical monuments, museums, and many diverse and thriving residential neighborhoods, and hopefully the White House too. That was an aside. Sorry, Eleanor, I couldn't resist. On behalf of the residents of the District of Columbia, you have my best wishes for a successful and memorable event. Anthony A. Williams, Mayor of the District of Columbia. I now have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you our moderator for today, Juan Williams. He will be moderating our 7th annual conversation on race, ethnicity, and culture. Mr. Williams is the author of several books, and I hope you've had the opportunity to read them, and if you haven't, Borders is not too far away from here. He has written the critically acclaimed biography, Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, as well as the nonfiction bestseller, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 to 1965. Following a 23-year career as a columnist, editorial writer, and White House correspondent for the Washington Post, Mr. Williams recently became senior correspondent for NPR, National Public Radio, after hosting NPR's Talk of the Nation. Now, if his face is familiar to you, you may know him from Fox News Sunday or host of America's Black Forum. Please join me in welcoming Juan Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beverly. I appreciate that introduction. We're gathered now for this wonderful panel, which will begin in just a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to signal that this is Dr. King's birthday, and it occurred to me Dr. King was born in 1929, so he would be 73 years old today. 73 is really not that old when you stop to think about some of our rock and roll stars today. Mick Jagger, I believe, is in his 60s. Tina Turner, who's still looking fine, is in her 60s, you know. You stop and think about Tony Bennett singing quite well, and you have no doubt that Dr. King would be still quite an effective leader, still quite a voice of conscience in our society if he were still with us. I think of Dr. King in relationship to this panel because of Dr. King's status as a faith leader in the tradition that so many of our speakers today still occupy. You think about Dr. King appealing to the American people in terms of conscience, in terms of us all being children of God, and putting that thought, that principle into action in terms of his activism and his commitment to activism through nonviolence. Truly, Dr. King continued a tradition that was set in place by other religious leaders going back to Sojourner Truth. I think of Malcolm X, I think of the Pope, I think of so many who have used the concept of religious principle and faith as the basis for building progressive movements in this country and nationwide. Now today in America we have a more fractured, more diverse population than ever. We have terrifically high rates of immigration. We have a census that reports that over a third of the population now is made up of people of color. America has never known such a wide demographic mix as we have witnessed today. And in fact, this demographic mix has led to a tremendous mix in terms of religious traditions. But it is the case that over 90% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll, profess to have deep felt religious beliefs. The question that we're going to try to address in this panel today is whether or not the variety of beliefs that we so deeply hold will bring us together or tear us apart. Because in this fractured society that we live in, it's very easy for people to become isolated, stereotyped, and for bigotry to prevail. So let me step away from this microphone. I hope that you can still hear me as I do, and begin this conversation. I'm not going to allow for opening statements. We've had some opening remarks by others. But what I am going to do is ask each of the panelists to speak to some results that came from Taking America's Pulse, a survey done by the National Conference that asked a very basic question, a question about how we as Americans get along across racial, cultural, religious divides. And the response was only 29% of us, of Americans, said that they were satisfied with how well people relate to each other across those divisions. So let me begin by asking Professor Diana Eck, who's at Harvard and who's been running the Pluralism Project at Harvard. Diana, if you could, very briefly for us, give us a sense of how diverse the religious community is in this country.
Well, I think the diversity of the religious community is related very much to the reason that we're here on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, which is that in the period of the 1960s, we actually passed a new Immigration Act a year after the Civil Rights Act that removed the cornerstone of racism from our immigration policy. People came from all over the world and brought their faith with them. So we have Muslim communities, both old Muslim communities and new Muslim communities, immigrant Muslim communities. We've got Hindus building temples in the suburbs of Washington, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists from all over Asia. So I think the scope of religious diversity is greater than ever before. And the question really is, can we engage that religious diversity in the way that enables us to transform our mere diversity into real pluralism?
Now, let me ask Reverend Richard Cizik to jump in here. Reverend Cizik, you represent so many of the evangelicals around the country. Often cited as the fastest growing denomination in the country.
Yes.
And I'm thinking to myself, you heard what Diana Eck was just saying about the pluralism in terms of religious worship. Do you see it, and do you see the evangelicals relating to people, the Muslims, the Sikhs, the others who are coming in to this country?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of evangelicals, I think it would be safe to say, and you have to be honest, I hope we'll all be honest here today. Let's be clear. A lot of evangelicals would be fearful. A lot of evangelicals, like other members of our society, are ignorant of people of other faiths. So having said that, which is, I think, is true of me as much as anyone else here in this room, we have to confess that. And once you do that, it's good for the soul, right? Confession is good for the soul. It's possible to go forward. Now, I think that we have to, in light of 9/11, taken the opportunity given us as Americans to begin anew a conversation in a new way. Let's face it, evangelicals have not been keen on ecumenical dialogue. We feel maybe it's because others don't accept our impulses, you know, our religious zeal or whatever. For whatever reasons, I would suggest it's a new day, and the challenges are enormous. We are stereotyped, absolutely. My grandmother was Jewish refugee from Western Poland who married an elevator operator in Chicago. I mean, Cizik is not a name most people know how to pronounce, much less spell. And yet, we evangelicals, for example, constitute 20% of the adult population of America by faith. But my brother here, who's Sikh, I have to be willing, consciously, to seek to understand. Not in some superficial, shallow ecumenical dialogue from my point of view, which is sometimes what ecumenical dialogue has been. Now, I'm not interested in that. But as for deeply seeking to understand on the basis that you will change as much as I will change, now that I think I'm interested in. And I think millions and millions of evangelicals are too.
Well, why don't we give Dr. Singh, Dr. Rajwan Singh, a chance to respond to just that. You hear someone who's been very honest, and I think we have to salute you for your honesty in saying that, you know, evangelicals have not and have been reluctant to embrace that kind of joining of hands. Dr. Singh, how would you respond, and what kind of response do you find from people on the street as well as in the religious community when you introduce yourself as a Sikh?
Well, my response to my brother would be that you know, this planet has been given as a gift to us, and that the whole humanity is the children of same father and mother. And we have to embrace the time we have on this planet. Is that the only way we can live together is to accept each other. And we have to go beyond just tolerating each other. And the only way we can accept each other is if you to understand where we come from. I admire his commitment to his faith, which says that Jesus is the only door to heaven. But at the same time, I feel that he will have to understand that there's another understanding how to reach to heaven, and we fully accept their view that that's the only way to go, but that is for them, and for us is a different path. So this accepting each other would only create a better society for all of us.
Now, you are involved with the Interfaith Network, and I'm thinking to myself, have you seen much success in terms of the ability of people of different religious faiths to join together, or do people feel as if they are giving up something of their essence by joining hands with people who come from different traditions?
Yes, I think this is a challenging moment for all of us. I mean, a month later or 2 weeks later after September 11, we have a wonderful service at the Yankee Stadium where people of different religions came together to pray together, and then 2 weeks later you hear in the newspapers people challenging those religious leaders who went to that somehow they have diluted their own commitment to their faith. It is a challenge, but I think many organizations are trying their best. In the foyer, there's a wonderful exhibition of different religions put together by the Interfaith Conference of Metropolitan Washington, which I used to be the president, and I'm still part of that organization. We all have to come out of our comfort zones in order to create this loving society.
Bishop Hoyt, as I believe you're president-elect of the National Council of Churches, I wanted to ask you if you would help us think about whether or not it is practical, realistic to expect that people of different faith traditions could come together at this moment when America is such a stew of different faiths.
I have two responses. One is, I think that a young lady came, when I was coming up here on a plane, she said, I have on a ring, and it's a diamond ring. She said it has a flaw in it, but she said it's still a diamond. I think that's America today. It has a flaw in it, but it's still a diamond. My concern is that we've got to deal with, in order to come together, we're going to have to deal with two things. One is a civic responsibility and a theological responsibility. Civically, I think Dr. Martin Luther King appealed to that in a very fine way when he talked about the Declaration of Independence, that one day he had a dream that we would live out the true meaning of our creeds, that we are all created equal, and that somehow we are born in terms of inalienable rights. And if you live out of that creed, then we can get religions together. I think Martin King did it in a way that I don't think anybody has been able to do in a long time. When they had the civil rights movement, we had all kinds of religious faiths coming together in a practical way. But right now, theologically, that's what divides us. Because theologically, we come up talking about Jesus is the way. And those who are Christians believe that. But they believe it from the context of sometimes exclusivism, that you cannot come through religious practices and come to God through any other way but through Jesus. And that somehow then judges the situation completely. We've got to raise the question, who is my neighbor? And when we start putting up fences against other people, then the neighbor gets skewed. Pat Buchanan, I just don't mind me calling his name, but he comes up with the understanding that the West is the thing that we've got to deal with. You got to think like the West, you got to eat like the West, you got to drink like the West, you got to look Western in order to be accepted. And otherwise, he says that we got to put a fence around people and deal with an isolationist point of view. And if that becomes an isolationist point of view, then we don't get together. We don't deal with each other. I would much rather deal with Martin Buber, the Jewish scholar, who said that we've got those who love, he says, bring God and the world together. And that is what Martin Luther King said, that injustice anywhere is against justice everywhere. And I mean, we've got to deal with bringing people together and to talk, if not anything else.
Now, I wanted to go to the other end of the panel to Jackie Johnson. And Jacqueline, I wanted to ask you, coming out of the American Indian tradition of many faiths existing within the Native American tradition, whether you see that as a clue for what we could do today in terms of trying to bring people who have different visions of how to get to heaven all to the same American table.
Well, I think that is a good example, because what happened in Indian country before we had a number of other religions come to America, we had a number of tribes who exercised religious practices differently. And even today we have over 570 some tribes who are their own governments and their own tribes and have variations in their religious practices. The premise behind most of all of the Native American religions, and certainly mine, is we respect all things. And if we start from just that premise of respecting all things, everything in front of our eyes, in our face, in front of our spirits and our bodies, then all of a sudden the differences don't become so extreme, because we've already given that. And as Native American cultures, we've been able to work together and fight together on issues, but we still have that same premise about who you are. And then, of course, what happened to us as the other formalized religions came to the Americas, we were divided up throughout the country and given different missionary efforts. So in our own communities now, not only do we have our own spirituality, which is very much a part of our business and the way that we do our work and our governments and our structure, but we also will have very strong connections to the Friends and the Catholics and the Methodists and Salvation Army and whoever happened to be assigned that area of the country to do their missionary work. And we've engaged both of those. The communities and the religious practices and the churches that I go to, we have a little of both as part of it, because it feels comfortable for us to be able to have who we are and who we believe and our spirituality tied into our neighbors, and we don't see it as a problem in bringing them both together.
Well, that's again an example of the history of this country and how people can come together. And I wanted to go now to Imam Wazdin Muhammad and ask you about these traditions, because in fact, you think back to your own transition, the transition of your group coming out of the Nation of Islam, now the largest Muslim organization in the United States. Do you see an opportunity for people truly to join hands, or are we all engaged in sort of pie-in-the-sky wishful thinking when we say it is possible to have different faiths work together in this country?
Yes, Juan, I'm a firm believer in the future of mankind on this earth. I believe that we are going to solve all of our problems and we're going to be one human family. But I would like to tell you a little something about myself. As I have grown as a leader, I have come to identify Martin Luther King as our leader, Jr. as our leader, and Elijah Muhammad as our leader too. And how has that happened? No matter what the rhetoric was, my father was trying to lead African-American spirit. And we are more spirit than we are ethnicity or culture. And he was trying to lead that spirit. And Dr. King was trying to lead the spirit of all people, I think, in America, so that we can be one.
And today?
And today, certainly.
What do you think are the chances that that spirit can reach out? And that spirit, especially coming on today, Dr. King's birthday, can be a spirit that others can be drawn to and maybe enlivened and thrilled by, so that we can understand the dream.
Well, if we can just overcome a few problems that we have, and I'll identify a couple. Had Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, and that's what we have to say as Muslims when we mention his name, had he been portrayed as a nappy-headed African, I wouldn't be here, because my father wouldn't have been here. So if we can overcome a few problems and really see the abstract or the transparent reality rather than the concrete reality, we'll have no problem. And I thank God I've overcome the concrete reality and for the transparent.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Rabbi Menatoff now to think about the difficulty that you, as a Jew, might have relating to Imam Wazdin Muhammad as a Muslim in this country, and yet in this country understanding that both of you have a legitimate role to play. Is it possible? Is there some possibility of the two of you ever working together?
Oh, absolutely. In many ways, I mean, there are obvious tensions that might emerge in terms of certain issues, but I think the barriers that would come between us aren't all that different from the barriers that would exist between me and probably every member of this panel. I don't think it's hard. I don't think it's easy at all in this country for people of different faiths to come together and really communicate on a substantive level. There are lots of gatherings where people get together and we say nice things. Bottom line, I really don't believe that there's an awful lot of interest both among clergy and the rank and file in sitting down in a real honest, intense way and exchanging views and ideas and coming to get to know each other better. Because I think pluralism, the emergence of real pluralism in this country has been a blessing on one side because it's given us all, no matter what our faith, an awful lot of opportunities. But the downside of that is that, in a sense, it sent a signal to us that we can turn inward, that we don't have to be quite as sensitive, or we don't have to worry as much about what another group might be thinking of us, because we're comfortable. I mean, the United States, thank God, has given us a comfortable and safe environment to exist in. So as a Jew, I don't have to be as concerned as maybe I did 3 decades ago about what another group might be thinking, and it's true of, I think, of the other groups who are represented here. So that in itself causes us to turn inward. It's very hard. One of the hardest things I do when working as the Executive Vice President of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the group that all the Reform rabbis are a part of, is to get really substantive, ecumenical conversation going, something that's going to result in changing the world in any way. It's hard for me to get my clergy to be interested in it, and when I sit down with a Catholic bishop or a cardinal or a bishop from the Episcopal Church, it's just as difficult for my counterpart to bring his or her troops to the table, because, you know, it's sort of, we get up in the morning when we've got one of those sessions and we kind of say, oh my God, do we do it today? And we kind of drag ourselves to the table and we wind up talking about stuff that, it's not that we don't like each other, but it's just like, so what difference is it all going to make? And we say nice things and like each other on a personal level, then we go back to our own groups and nothing happens. So I think that plays out in society in general, I think. There's more of a turning inward, not only on an individual level, but on all sorts of levels. And on the most destructive side, you see it when it turns into violence against certain groups within the country, certain minorities. Thank goodness that's on the decline, but it's still a problem. And you see it in terms of what's happened to our public schools in the United States, which are really going downhill because it's not a priority for us. And what that means ultimately is that my kids aren't going to school with your kids, and that's really a disaster for us in terms of this country.
Ms. Alkhateeb, I wanted to ask you to join in here and tell us a little bit about your efforts as president of the Muslim Education Council, because I'm wondering if in educating young people who are Muslim, you ever say to them, here is a sense of what it's like to be a Christian, here's what it's like to be a Jew, and here is the importance of knowing and respecting and even embracing those other traditions so that we can work with people who come from other faiths.
Actually, we train educators and administrators around the country who are in public schools and private schools. And we do some work as liaison between the community who is Muslim and Arab with the public school systems as well, and private schools. And we try our best to express the views, and even when we put together a panel, we try to put together a panel or a workshop that includes Christian people from the Middle East, Jewish people from the Middle East, people who are even Baha'i or Sikh or other religions, so that they get a flavor for who's there. And some people think the Middle East only means the Arabic-speaking countries, but for purposes of the State Department and other places, it goes all the way up to India. So we try to be very inclusive and explain that the right of every single person in America and upholding those rights of every single person upholds our own rights. If we're not willing to do that, we also lose. Each individual loses. And so that's what we're involved in, trying to do that, and trying to make people understand that when Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, unless we're all willing to say, I'm going to allow my other person sitting next to me to also have their dream, and it might not be my own, but they have a right to their dream. Unless we're willing to say that and really mean it, then we're in trouble as America. But if we can mean that, then we have hope.
But even I'm thinking, respecting a dream is still a step from working with someone else to achieve a common dream. And so, in your opinion, we're steps away, maybe miles away from that.
But I think if we can attempt to try to find out the common ground between us and have conversations going on from our kitchen tables to our boardrooms to our, at the national level, holding conversations like this one on what our common ground is and what ideals do we hold in common as Americans that can cement us together once again and heal the wounds that we have seen in post 9/11. I think that we have hope for moving together as a unified country.
Reverend Coughlin, I wanted to ask you about this idea of different faiths working together because you work in the political realm. At least you work in a situation that's political. You may not be political yourself, but even your selection became a matter of politics, a resistance to have a Catholic serve in that position. Does this suggest to you that it's impossible for us to, and impractical for us to be sitting here talking about blending faith traditions, or is it possible?
It's certainly possible. And I want to say maybe my own experience of becoming the chaplain in the house, it just reaffirms me all the more strongly in that conviction that all of us are on for this, all of us. And all of us are willing, hopefully willing to step up to what the American dream is. Sometimes I agree with the rabbi, we're polite and tolerant even, but to deal with each other's dreams, to listen long enough and hear people's dreams. I believe one of the things that becomes very strong in my conviction in coming here today is that we have to work hard at religion. One of the introductory speakers said that Martin Luther King was constantly testing himself and testing his own principles. All of us need to be on for that testing. Where's the bigotry in me? Where's the bigotry in you? And to be honest, as someone else said, I think it was my friend the Sikh, no, the evangelist, that basically that's good. Confession is good for the soul. I'll tell you a story that happened to me early on after I got to Congress. Within the first week, two, I was walking through Statuary Hall, and I love Statuary Hall because it's all the heroes, heroines in marble and concrete and bronze, and usually loaded with teenagers, who are the future of the American dream and carriers of that future. And as I'm going through this, a rather frail Afro-American man comes up to me and says, "You're the new chaplain?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, what are you going to do about the fracases going on here before you got here?" I said, "I wasn't here." He said, well, I mean, there was this going on. What are you going to do about it? I said, "Well, I was in Chicago. I'm a nobody." And that's it. He says, "You're a nobody. And you came here to tell anybody that there is somebody who has salvation and grace for everybody." And isn't that the call of all of us in America? And basically, this country gives us the freedom to do it, to be it, to be constantly converting ourselves and converting the dialogue and turning it deeper, because that's what religion is about. It seems to me, often enough, when we talk about Martin Luther King, one of the sad things is that our children don't even know that he was a minister. Don't even know that this wonderful civil rights heritage, just like our Islamic and Jewish brothers and sisters of the past and Catholics of the past. I mean, we've come through a lot. And it's religion, though, that really made it happen in the civil rights movement here. And I just think religion is on for it. I think we're on for the dialogue. I think we're on for the motivation, on for the conviction. And some of it is the call of all of us to be truer to our own traditions to their depth so that we can talk to people on a deeper level.
Raul Izagirre, who's the president of La Raza, now I just spoke to Reverend Coughlin as a man who sees the political world, tries to create coalitions. You are a man who has a tremendous history as a civil rights leader in this country, coming out of the Hispanic tradition. And I'm wondering if you're sitting here and looking at these guys and realizing the difficulties that minority groups in this country have coming together. You're looking at this as an interfaith opportunity for coalition thinking, this is even more difficult. These folks don't even understand how difficult it can be and how many issues can separate people who might even identify themselves as minorities in this country. Am I right? Am I wrong? Or do you see greater opportunity here?
Well, if you're in the civil rights movement, you have to, in order to survive, you have to be an optimist. So my reaction is yes, it can be done. Si se puede, as we say in Spanish. It can be done and it will happen. But it is challenging. By the way, as people were talking about religion and bigotry, it occurred to me that much more blood has been spilled in the name of God than in the name of the devil. And we're preaching, all religions preach love, but too many practice hate. And I think that if we can start reaching deeper into our own traditions and say, you can never justify an evil deed in the name of God. And just that's a very simple message like that. If we can articulate it, it will, I think it might have some resonance. Indeed, coalition building is a very important, very difficult, very challenging task. There's much that divides us. Fortunately, I think I represent a community that by its very nature is inclusive. You know, 1/3 of us, of our blood is Jewish blood. Maybe 1/3 is Arab blood. In Spain, the Jewish community reached its zenith in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. It was occupied for 800 years by Moors, by Arabs. It was invaded by Germanic tribes. It comes over to this country and intermarries with Native American groups. And Africans are imported into the Caribbean and to other parts, and we intermarry with Africans. So our term for la raza comes from the term la raza cósmica, which means we celebrate our diversity. We understand that we have different roots, and that's what makes us proud. So I think we're in a good position to form and be part of a coalition. I have to tell you that our greatest challenge, the census says we were 35.3 million. That doesn't include another 5 million in Puerto Rico. That was in 1999. And now in 2002, we're over 40 million people, the largest minority in this country and the most misunderstood, the most ignored, the most invisible. So we're trying to reach tokenism. Tokenism will be a step forward, and I hope I can get some help from you, Juan.
And in terms of religious practices,
I can agree with that.
How would you characterize that community?
Well, it's the father and I were having an interesting conversation at lunch. It is overwhelmingly Catholic, and one of the things that one needs to understand about our community is the lack of institutions. And one of those, I mean, by institutions, I mean community-controlled institutions. Churches were a very important part of the African-American civil rights movement. And unfortunately, because we don't control the Catholic Church, which is the faith that predominantly we belong to, that has not been an aid, an instrument of our progress as it has been in the African-American community, as has been in the Jewish community. So we have a lot of dialoguing to do with our own church. We're about 40% of all Catholics in this country are Hispanic. We're going to be the majority of the Catholic Church. Yet, and there's Catholic, African-American, black colleges and universities, but there are no Hispanic Catholic universities. No Hispanic universities of any scope at all. So I think, you know, we've got a dialogue. We have a heavy agenda with the Catholic Church. But interestingly enough, what is, you might have read some articles in the Washington Post, there's 50,000 Muslim Hispanics, and the fundamentalist churches are making enormous strides in our community. And so we're becoming religiously diverse as we are culturally and racially diverse as well.
Sanford Cloud, I wanted to ask you to, having listened now, having heard this entire and diverse panel speak on the notion of bringing religious plurality to some meaningful point, to some point that would allow people to work together to really accomplish something, and not, as the rabbi was saying, simply say, oh, it's that day, we got to meet again, and we got to go through this shadow and act. Do you believe there's a possibility for some worthwhile, actual work to be done here on an interfaith basis?
Juan, like Raul, being in this work of human rights and human relations and civil rights, I'm an optimist as well by nature. So I do believe generally there is a real opportunity for us to do some meaningful work as we become more religiously diverse as a nation. And I'm hopeful that there will be, but I think there's some real challenges. I think Richard raised one, I think Paul raised another around the comfort level, about our comfortableness about being with people we know, people who look like us, people who talk like us, people who practice a similar faith. Thinking about Dr. King on this day, I think he would be pleased with the growth of diversity in faith communities in our country today. When one realizes that we now have well over 1 million Hindus, more than 2 million Buddhists, Islam representing the fastest growing faith community in this country, depending on whose figures you look at, somewhere between 4 to 7 million, with an average of all of the studies that have been done about 5 million. I think he'd be excited about that, that diversity and the opportunity it represents for us to become an even stronger and richer nation as a result thereof. Having said that, I think we've got some real challenges in order to engage that diversity in a way that we haven't yet. I think there's some voices in this country, particularly coming out of the Christian faith community, who are threatened by that diversity, who don't like what it represents, who do not like and appreciate the newness of the cultures that it brings, that diversity. So I think we've got some challenges with respect to being sure that there are other voices from other faith communities in our country that begin to raise those voices up again in the manner of Dr. King, to celebrate the diversity of these faith communities. Secondly, we need to really begin to reach out to those who are different, the others. Our own TAP survey indicates that 36% of the American people don't know enough about a Muslim to form an opinion about them. Only 24% of the American people have ever even met a Muslim. And yet Islam represents the fastest growing faith community in our country. So the reaching out is critically important, particularly by the Abrahamic faith communities in our country and the other faith communities that are becoming more and more the landscape and the fabric of our society. So I think that particularly those Abrahamic faith communities have to be engaged in reaching out. I'd also say that the other faith communities that are newer to the society also have an obligation to engage the broader community. I understand some of the necessity of community, of being together, but in this country, I think that part of our challenge is going to be, can we reach out across these divides in order to learn more about each other, learn more about each other's faith communities, in order that we do so in a way that then leads us to action and a broader community engagement. Not engaging another faith simply to further understand the theological underpinnings of another faith. That's great. That's important. But what King would have done, and what we need to be about engaging in doing, is to learn more about each other's faiths and cultures, so that will lead us to empower leaders and institutional change and transform community, to make our communities more just and more whole, to tackle the educational problem, to deal with the issue that racism is still abound in this country. And one of the things that we're doing at NCCJ that President Clinton got us started with was to engage in a broad spectrum of faith communities across all the divides, to indicate that faith leaders in this country ought to be denouncing racism as a sin, a problem of the heart,
and evil that's got to be eradicated. If we can come to common ground around that set of issues and have faith leaders take their proper role of leadership in light of King and what King was all about, then we'd be a long way down the road of celebrating each other a little bit better and making our communities more whole and more just.
Well, I think everyone can applaud that. I was thinking as I was listening to the entire panel, though, that one of the realities of America is marketing. And in a country that's growing and that's so diverse, there are lots of people who think, well, if I just focus on my particular niche group, on my particular faith, and try to grow that niche group a little bit, I can be explosively profitable, happy, successful. I really don't need, in this fractured American picture of at the start of the 21st century, to reach out. And I was noticing in the TAP, as you call it, but it's Taking America's Pulse survey done last year, that more people, I'm just going to read it here, more people say they are far away rather than close to atheists, Muslims, gays, and lesbians. They're sort of neutral towards people who are Asians, Jews, immigrants, Hispanics, American Indians, fundamentalist Christians, and they feel somewhat close to blacks, the poor, people who have disabilities, elderly, and the whites. But you get a sense right at the start that when it comes to atheists, to Muslims, to gays and lesbians, that no matter what the faith tradition, there's a certain sense of distance. Diana, you're
Yeah,
gesturing.
I want to respond to that because that survey was done in 2000. That is not a sort of post-9/11 survey. The Pew survey that has been done in October had 59% of Americans having a positive view of Islam, as opposed to only 45% last March. Now that's interesting. And I think it's precisely because there are lots of people who have responded to that with an eagerness to reach out, who don't feel the sort of ho-hum that the rabbi was talking about in terms of going across the boundary of uncomfortable presence into someone else's religious community.
So you think we have a newly revived and invigorated sense that we must reach out?
Well, and that we have reached out. More Americans know more about Islam and Sikhism now than they did 6 months ago by a long shot. And as our bombers were flying nonstop to Afghanistan, mosques all over America were having open houses. And, you know, people in San Antonio, by the hundreds, who had never been in a mosque before, were crossing that zone of comfort, and 700 of them show up at a mosque, or 500 in Cambridge on a sunny afternoon, 1,000 in Denver, 2,000 to ring the mosque in Toledo after it had been shattered with rifle fire the night before. People who had never been to a mosque before. And, I mean, there's a real sense that whatever else may bring us together, one thing that will bring us together is violence against our neighbors or the denigration of our neighbors. And maybe that's a good place to start. Or maybe the fact that we need to know more about Sikhs and Muslims, and whether it's Oprah Islam 101 on daytime TV or Larry King finally inviting a couple of Muslims to the talk shows, we actually have heard more Muslim voices, more Sikh voices. And so I think that's a positive thing.
So I'm thinking, as I listen to you, that it's when you see one religious faith attacked that suddenly the American family will join hands and say, no, that's wrong, don't do that.
This is not who we are. One guy shot Balbir Singh Sodhi in Mesa, Arizona, a couple of days after September 11th, gas station attendant. Hundreds of people brought flowers and candles to his gas station. 3,000 people showed up at the Civic Center to go to his service, people who had no idea who the Sikhs were. And to date, 10,000 people have written emails or letters or cards to Balbir Singh Sodhi's family. Now that, to me, is a pretty remarkable vote.
So that's one thing that we can say here, standing here today on Dr. King's birthday, that we believe is deeply enmeshed in the American spirit, and that we realize we will defend each other's right to practice religion and not to suffer bigotry.
Yep.
Dr.
I
Singh?
think, well, let me just add to that, Juan. I think that I hear Diane, and I think everything that she said has some merit. But I have to tell you that, it's been nice to watch the interfaith engagement post 9/11. and all of the leadership comes together across the divides of faith community and do what one of my colleagues says, kumbaya, kumbaya with one another. But the question is, what is the work that's going to be done after that service, after that event? What's the engagement that's going to be, that's going to bring Tom Hoyt together with a Paul Menitoff, with a Imam W. Dean Muhammad together, to really engage? How do we go about developing better understanding, respect among us all? How do we get Richard Cizik and his colleagues to engage across these divides with respect to some of the community, even though we might differ theologically?
Well, he's sitting right next to you, so let's get an answer.
Well, I would, what does it take is the question, to join this. Frankly, I don't like the word dialogue. A friend of mine says, don't use that word, trash the word, talk about deeper understanding, because dialogue is too superficial. We Americans are superficial people. I'm sorry to say it, but we are. We're the Mech generation. We are the quickie culture. We are the people who will say hi and goodbye, and it's the end of the conversation. And we've had a conversation. No, we have not had a conversation. Most Americans have not with someone of another faith. In fact, I am usually the guy who says the glass is half full, but I have to agree with Sanford. One of the consequences of 9/11 I'm deeply concerned about will be, in fact, the increasing privatization of belief. Now, this is a trend which characterizes across the board Protestant, Catholic, and others. The Pew Forum sponsored a study of this, and it's the increasing trend of churches and mosques and synagogues, the privatization of faith. Public issues aren't discussed in these institutions. Moreover, our churches, synagogues, and mosques talk about spiritual growth, private spiritual growth in this important vertical relationship, but the horizontal is amiss. And 9/11 has sent a message to millions of people worldwide: religion is dangerous. Now, I'm sorry, but that's my critique. The negative side of 9/11, now it's true, the positive is, as many of you have described, the new openness, the challenge, the opportunity, and it's true the American public says, in terms of whether or not the country is going in the right direction, they say, hey, pre-9/11, no it's not, post-9/11, it is going in the right direction. Amazing consequence, complete flip, according to the pollsters, over whether the country is going in the right direction. Why? Because they saw our nation's public servants in the face of a fiery hell cross themselves, kneel, and go in to save other people's lives. That's my explanation. But in the face of those positive examples, incredible courage in the face of adversity, the bigger picture is not terribly encouraging in terms of religion in general in public. And I think every one of us in this room has a responsibility and obligation to do what we can to increase what is real communication, not simply superficial dialogue.
Well, let me just put it to you.
Yes.
So what Sanford said to you was, what are people in the evangelical faiths, the fast-growing evangelical faiths, willing to do to get beyond their suspicion and maybe even their fear of people of other faiths?
Pastors and others have to teach, as they do the whole counsel of God, that knowledge, knowing, requires doing. Look, we are not afraid, I don't think, to engage in real dialogue when somebody else is willing to engage that in a real way and say, I'm willing to change. I'm not simply coming to the conversation, Sanford, to defend myself. I'm not coming to that. I shouldn't be. If that's what I'm doing, just to come to defend myself, then I don't think that you're talking about can occur. So there are some positives. I hope and pray that one of the consequences will be greater space for us to do this in the American experiment. Greater space, public space. But the privatization of religion, which says, hey, I don't carry what I really believe into public, and that will change.
Let me ask Dr. Singh to jump in here.
Well, I think, you may say that the religion is a private thing. For Sikhs, it's not a private thing. I have to wear a turban 24 hours, 7 days.
Good point. Good point. You aren't allowed to privatize your faith.
That's right.
That's right.
what we do on Sunday, we have to carry 5, 6 other days throughout our life, and every moment of our life we are representing something.
But you, in fact, may be discriminated against for that. People may think, gee, that's odd. The rest of Americans privatize their faith.
Absolutely. In fact, you know, my own brother was told by a governmental agency to take off his turban and shave off his beard to show up to work the next day. But he, of course, he protested, and we received a lot of support from the governmental agencies as well as public. And I think post-September 11, there's a mixed reaction to the Sikhs. I mean, when you said that 29% don't even have any clue who Muslims are or don't have any closeness, we somehow are dragged into that category because most of the people feel that believe that we are either from Middle East or we are Muslims or we are somehow related to Osama bin Laden. And because of that, we have had over 200 cases of violence and against the Sikhs, and one of them were killed. And 3 weeks ago in Los Angeles, a Sikh was attacked, literally survived a very severe violent act. There is a mixed reaction. There is outpouring of support from many.
Hang on a second. I'm just going to, you know, if anyone in this room doesn't have a cell phone, thank you. But if you do, turn it off. Thanks.
And so I feel that just as I think you were saying that the minority communities also have to make an effort to educate others. And I think the challenge is on both sides, that the minorities and majority communities have to build bridges, have to make an effort to come to a real, deeper understanding, yes, rather than just a dialogue, which I think that the real dialogue only we have had when somebody has come to convert me, when they knocked the door. That's the only time.
Now, yeah. I don't dispute that has occurred. How can I dispute that has occurred? But I think it's a bit of a stereotype of evangelicals to say that too, that that's our only interest, to convert someone. I mean, that is I think a violation of what we as evangelicals really are as a people. In other words,
He wasn't
are
evangelical.
Oh, okay.
What did you say? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
He wasn't an evangelical.
Okay. Well, evangelicals are out sharing their faith in often aggressive ways, in some ways that constitute proselytizing, which is, in my estimation, going over the board. But nonetheless, it's not the goal. Now, I shouldn't attack or appear to attack the host, but you used language, one, that said blending of faiths. Now, wait a minute. That is not quite what we are about here.
Oh, no, you should attack the host. Everyone else makes a practice of it, so I wouldn't want you to miss out on that American dream. But when I say that, what I'm talking about is in the tradition of people, even if they retain their religious principles and identity, being able to blend and work with each other in terms of higher purpose, what Stanford was talking about, some of these issues, education, healthcare, yes, things that are problems in our society, allowing us to come together over those religious divides to have real achievement. Let me ask Rabbi Menikoff to jump in.
Well, I think that, that the reality is that one of the reasons we have different religions is that we believe, essentially, we believe different things. I mean, we all believe that we're all created in the image of God, so we're all, you know, God's children. Once you get beyond that, we believe radically different approaches to the whole area of religion and the pathways to God. So I think that part of the reason it's so difficult to develop any kind of interest in religionists, clergy or non-religious, to sit down at a table and to talk about this is that, well, it is kind of, it's nice to learn about each other, but it's all kind of academic until we get down to the nitty-gritty of what do we really believe, what do we really believe, and if I really believe it, then in some level I have to think that you're probably on the wrong track. So it sets up either a deadly boring dynamic or a very interesting one that becomes offensive. So it seems to me that the way that we have to go in terms of interreligious dialogue, and it gets back to what you were referring to. After 9/11, people went to mosques and they showed support because a religious group was being hurt. There was bigotry being focused on a religion. So we came out. We have to be project-oriented. We can't sit there and talk about big ideas and what we believe. We have to find projects. We have to work about what do we do about people on welfare? How do we raise the standard of living for people in our society? All of those bottom line issues, that's how we can be together, and that makes sense in terms of ecumenicism.
Now, Jackie, you were raising your hand anxiously to join in here.
Well, I guess I wanted to make a point. We talk a lot about the religious, and I wanted to make sure that organizations, that in Indian country, it's a Native American spirituality, and not necessarily always focused into a certain sect or organization, or and we still have to allow for that voice to be there too, the spirituality. And the thing that's very difficult for us, very similar to wearing your religion 24/7, is it's ingrained into the way that we do business. It's the way that we educate. It's the way that we deal with our children and our government structures. But we deal with issues such as sacred sites that are so precious to us, that are very, very important to our practice of religion, but yet it's very much misunderstood by the public at large. And those kinds of being able to not necessarily convert, but to understand and accept each other, and then from there support each other in our own efforts that may be political efforts, such as an issue of sacred sites, but also to be able to come together, as you were just talking about, on the issues that affect us, the economic environment of our communities. There's something that we could all do and join together with, and I just wanted to make sure that that was real clear from our perspective.
Now, Bishop Hoyt, from your perspective as President-elect of the National Council of Churches, you must have some experience in this business of bringing people together to work on practical ends. And I'm thinking, you know, you heard here today, people say, well, some of these Christian faiths, they're very threatened by all these newcomers and the growth. Are you threatened? Are you fearful? Or do you think there's real opportunity?
Well, I think that we're dealing with what I've heard on the panel is a matter of the thrill. Either we come together on the basis of the thrill, or we come together on the basis of the threat of extinction and the threat of death. And in those two instances, when the thrill is gone and when the threat is gone, how do we maintain our connectedness at that point? And I think the only way we're going to maintain it is to bring people around a dialogical table. I have to say that dialogue is critical, and at the same time, when you get around the dialogue, it cannot be about evangelizing other faiths. It's got to be on the basis of, I agree with what has been said about the projects that you will enter into and what it means to enter into some economic justice issues that will make it possible for people to have some jobs, to have a house, to have a place to deal with staying in a comfortable place. At the same time, to deal with some justice issues about what it means to have education, good education. All of that is, I think we can agree on that. We can work together on that.
Well, hang on a second, because history would say that, in fact, there's been a difficult time even getting faith leaders to speak out against racism, against segregation. And those were major flaws in the American diamond, to use the analogy someone else brought up earlier.
And I think you're right. It's because of a theological mindset that some people think you don't have to deal, religious leaders ought not deal with public policy issues. They ought to leave that to the government. And we take care of, quote, religious issues, as if that has nothing to do with the whole of life. Religion has to do with all of life. And just to compartmentalize life, it puts us in a bag that says, politician, you take care of that, and we'll take care of the souls of people. That's a bifurcation that deals with, I think, the Greek mindset in many respects, that says that the body belongs to humanity and the soul belongs to God. And so therefore, when blacks were in slavery, they told us, give your body to us and give your soul to Christ. Well, that completely bifurcates and tears apart the holistic viewpoint of life. And I think there are some religions who would rather deal with with dealing with me and God than me, God, and humanity. And that gets into a whole matter of communitarian mindset that talks about the community moving out to do some things together, not just of me and mine. What does the community do to work together for justice issues? So I would agree with what Sandra said, that Senator Cloud said that what do you do once you get together is the critical question. Once we sit down and talk together, how do we then deal with working together? And I think that's the key. The World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches, all have brought people together around the table. They've talked, and then they've seen, right now we have a poverty issue going on. How do we get together to work for poverty, against poverty among all the people? That's where I think the National Council is moving. Andrew Young was the president of the National Council for 2 years prior to this year, and he was stressing to the National Council what it means to deal with poverty issues and justice issues in regards to that, as was Dr. King. That was his chief tenet, to just eradicate poverty.
Let me ask Ms. Alkhateeb about, for example, working on women's issues through religious organizations. I know that you've worked on spousal abuse issues, you've worked with children, parenting. Is it possible, is it advantageous to use a faith-based initiative to achieve some social end?
Sure. I mean, if we approach things through the faith-based perspective, we can have more respect in what we're doing, both within the community, our own communities, and dealing with the wider society. And I think many times it happens, and it has happened across the country, where women will be trying to accomplish a social goal, and they've been working with non-Muslim groups in accomplishing those social goals, and the local Muslim community wouldn't work with them. And then when they got the recognition and respect from the non-Muslim community, then the Muslim community gave them the respect that they wanted from the beginning.
These are women in the Muslim community?
Yes, women in the Muslim community and men in the Muslim community. So sometimes connecting with people in the wider society actually brings people within the circle of actually solving the social problems that they might have ignored otherwise, thinking that, because many people, whether they are people born in this country or people who are immigrants, they may feel like those are either private issues, or they may feel that those issues are issues that they don't need to solve because they're going to just save enough money and go back home somewhere else. But their kids are saying, I'm American, I'm not going anywhere, we need to solve the problems. So I think solving the problems has been done by way of a few people in the communities reaching out and making sure that they solve the social problems with non-Muslims and then bringing it back into the community.
All right. Let me open it up now to questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes to go, and I invite you to take advantage of the 2 microphones that are going to be circulating. Let me go over to Diana right here.
My name is Walter Diggs. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, the United Methodist pastor there, Church of the Reconcilers. And the question that I have is that the 9/11 event was an extreme expression of violence. And violence is often related and connected deeply to religion. And that event of 9/11 reminded me of my own religious tradition's use of violence to oppress blacks in America through the Klan, as a Southern Methodist person, that tradition. So the question that I have, is it possible for Martin King's commitment to find an alternative to violence and war to be a point of departure for us to build a much deeper dialogue among ourselves as religious leaders and our religious communities?
I'm not sure I understood the question. You mean, is it possible for Dr. King's tradition? You mean the Baptist tradition? You mean the Christian tradition? What do you mean?
I mean, Dr. King had a deep commitment to nonviolence and finding an alternative to war. And he felt that, the human family's future was dependent upon our capacity to do that. And is that place a point of nonviolence and elimination of war, and using his strategies of nonviolent direct action, a place where we can begin a much deeper dialogue among our religious communities?
Well, hang on a second and don't go away, because I want to ask you a question. after September 11th, would you have said that Dr. King would have refused to go after the terrorists and said that as a principle of nonviolence, the United States should not have retaliated?
What I would say was that Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin King addressed a very devastatingly violent situation in Birmingham, Alabama, with the principles of nonviolence, and was successful. And it was a religious issue, religious violence, opposed to principles of nonviolence. And so I'm not, I don't want to get into the dialogue about our response to 9/11. I know all of our panelists have talked about violence, the violence done to the Sikh with his head, with his turban, and others, violence to women, all kind of violence related to religion and has its roots in religion. And is the discussion around eliminating violence, the use of religious violence, a place to begin a more constructive dialogue for interfaith relationships?
All right, so let me ask, who would like to respond here? Rabbi?
Well, I think that that we have to take two questions very seriously that comes out of that. What do we do in our religious traditions when in some way they motivate a segment of our people to act in a violent way against others? And that's something we have to take very seriously, because in most traditions, if not all, there's a fanatical element. And what do we do about that? And how do we speak out against that? And how do we teach our children that that just is a perversion of our particular tradition? That's one. The second that was referred to by, I think, two panelists here, it's kind of a corollary to your question, is the idea, and ultimately, isn't it a fair question to ask, has religion in a sense caused more problems than it's solved? Has religion at the base of most wars, of most major wars, minor wars, through the centuries and in our world now, when you scrape it all away, isn't religion one of the base causes of it? Now, I'm not sure of the answer to that, but what I am sure of is that I think each of our traditions and each of us as religionists need to take that question very seriously and look at it and see what answer we come up with, but do it in a way that we don't just wind up with some platitudes, but we really do some serious introspection.
Imam Muhammad, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I want to respond. My studies and my experience has brought me to believe that the problem for us with religion is that our scriptures are intended for scholars and inspired people, and the leaders should give the plain common message to the masses. The Bible should not be in the hands of the masses. The Quran is not even safely in the hands of the masses with the popular idea of what Islam is now.
Explain that to me a little bit.
There are passages in the Bible and in the Quran. There are safe sentences, statements, etc., that are dangerous in the hands of fools.
Subject to distortion.
Yes, sir.
Let me guess Reverend Cochran to jump in here.
Well, since 9/11, infrequently in conversations I've asked people, I said, now this is a rhetorical question. Rhetorical question, it doesn't need a response. You need to tell me as I should stop asking this question. But the rhetorical question is, in the evening of September 11th and on September 12th, weren't you glad that in America here we have a civil, if you will, a civilian government, not led by mullahs or militarists? My point being, religion sometimes in its own way, especially when it's the dominating force, has been the result of lots of evils. Military, the same way. Aren't we blessed that we have something in the middle, which is government, in the hands of civilians, where if you will, the peace movement or the anxiety movement can come from religion, and the military can be there or not be there as needed. I mean, isn't it the balance here that aren't there, as I would suspect there are a lot of people who, for religious convictions, do question how much bombing, how much warring is going to be necessary. That's a good instinct. It's not dictating policy, but it's a good instinct. Aren't we all praying for peace? Aren't we hoping that everyone perhaps will look at the world a bit differently? Doesn't God change the hearts? We may have to get into dialogue and some argument to change minds, but I also believe in the power of prayer, and I also believe in the power that God can use anything to change people's ways of not only thinking, but of doing. Sometimes, like in the history of Israel and the history of the Christian church, he's backed us into the future.
Bishop Hoyt.
The question that was raised about, I think Dr. King said a good thing. He said, and the biblical text bears it out, that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth will leave everybody eyeless and toothless. And I think that what he's getting at is that we can't afford to become like the thing we fight against. If we fight against injustice, we ought not to become unjust. If we fight against militarism, we ought not become militaristic. And I think that what that affects us in terms of, King said again that anybody any nation that would put guns over butter is morally bankrupt. Because what he was trying to say is that you got to put both the matter of guns in the proper perspective, and that you don't negate your people and put them in poverty and put all money, starve the social programs and stuff the Pentagon. That in its own way is I think, it cuts back on the prophetic mindset of the church and the synagogue and the mosque. If we can't say that, if we can't say that as religious leaders, then I think it cuts back on our prophetic stance, and it therefore negates our influence in the greater politic. I think the body politic needs to hear what the churches, the mosques, the synagogues need to say about what it means to treat people right, not just that God bless America, but God bless the world.
So you would disagree with what Reverend Coughlin was saying about the virtue of having a non-faith-based government in this country, that we can all pray for peace, but it's important that people from all faith groups come together in government, in civilian government, to make a determination of policy. You disagree with that?
I do. I think we need to be actively engaged in talking about the body politic and how that affects people not only here, but across the world. Because our tentacles are very strong across the world. And so people don't get angry with us over here just because they want to get angry. They have some reasons for getting angry. And we have to ask the question, why are they angry with America? And why are they out to get America? It's not just they think we are so wealthy, but it's because of some of the things we put in place also that has some governmental tentacles there that have sometimes oppressed the people.
But I think, and I'm speaking here for Reverend Coughlin, so he can jump in and interrupt me at any moment, but I'm thinking that if you had your wish come true, then you would have differences in religious belief played out on the political stage and exacerbate the tensions in this very diverse society.
I think that the tensions are necessary in order to get people's attention and also to get people to begin to work together. You can't talk about the issues that matter and not have tension. If you're talking about poverty issues, you start taking sides with the poor folk and start trying to alleviate their conditions and see if people don't get after you. They got after Martin Luther King, not because he was preaching the right thing. They got after him because it was effective. That people start going around, going to jail, doing some things for the understanding of God's people. And so the effectiveness of a message is what's important. Putting your life on the line for justice issues means that you're willing to go to the cross. And I think I was... Other crescent. Well, that's right. Go somewhere where there's some death going.
Let me ask Reverend Coughlin to respond to this.
I agree with everything what the bishop is saying, is that I think The depth of religion is to have its influence upon the local community and the government community. And that's part of the freedom of religion, that we have the voice. I think sometimes it is religious leaders that are waiting for somebody to ask them. They're passive, more passive sometimes in our tolerance with one another. Passive intolerance can be just as insulting as some of the other things that have been described. It's entering in. It's entering in more deeply into our traditions and willing to get into the dialogue and to make our voices heard. I think the question, one that you've pressed often enough here is, what can we do? I think we can stop preachers, teachers of religion, can break the comfort zone. I remember in a racism workshop myself, coming to terms with, I've been preaching, trying to make people feel comfortable so they'd come back again next week because, I want to lead them somewhere. Well, the next Sunday was the time to lead them. We can't just tolerate the comfort zone. We have to keep opening it up for people, giving them the permission to go to the mosque. We can't wait for bishops or I think government to say, let's have a dialogue, let's learn more. I want to say to you, though, that members of Congress have said to me, we need to know more. We need to know more about that part of the world. We need to know more about the Muslim religion. They want to understand so that they don't just make mistakes. Now, where does that come from? I mean, basically, I'm happy to say that I, in conversation, find that sometimes they're taking the leadership back in their districts to make exactly the conversations happen.
But where are the voices? Where are the voices within the faith communities, Father, across the country that should be raising their voices around justice issues? The only voices that we hear today prominently in this country coming from the faith community are those who are demonizing other faiths. They seem to get to a big play, a lot of press, a lot of media. And that's fine, but you don't hear the counterbalancing clarity of voices from other parts of the faith community that are saying, we do need to engage the issue of racism in this country today. We do need to engage the issue of public education, school reform. We do need to engage the fact that discrimination still goes on a daily basis toward African Americans, Latinos, Asians, gay and lesbian people, people with physically and other disabilities. Something is missing in the fabric of our society with respect to the voice of the faith leader in our country. And I'm trying to understand why that is and how can we further empower that faith leader to take his or her rightful role of leadership on social justice issues again today.
I think you're right if you're waiting for another Martin Luther King. But I think
I'm not waiting for another Martin Luther King. That's my point.
Well, that's what I hear. I'm sorry. That's what I hear, that you're waiting for some kind of another leader like that who can galvanize the various, and then in that term, just Christian churches. But I want to say, I think there are a lot of them out there. I think there are a lot of people stepping up to the plate, and I think there's a lot more as a result of 9/11. I think there are, I know ministers and rabbis and a lot of social actionists, as well as just pastors, pastoring their people, trying to address these issues.
Let me speed everything up here and ask everyone to kind of go into a lightning mode in terms of responses, but I know that Raul Izaguirre wanted to make a comment.
The use of religion as a basis for formulation of public policy is a double-edged sword, and we need to recognize that. I'm in the civil rights movement because of my religious beliefs. I recognize that. I understand it. But I'm very careful about how I use religion to further public policy stands. The Bible doesn't tell me how to vote on a missile defense system. And people need to understand that. And we also need to understand that people who have very religious beliefs on questions like abortions are inspiring people to go and kill doctors on the basis of religion. This is a powerful force, and we need to use it very, very carefully. It is as powerful as an atomic bomb, and we need to tell our religious leaders, yes, there are zones of appropriate behavior to use religion for influencing public policy, but there's also areas where we ought to stay away from. Right. And that ought to be played out in the secular, and this has gotten a bad rap among religious leaders to talk about secular politics, secular humanism, but there are secular values that unite all of us, that should unite all of us, that at their basis are really what religion is all about.
Mm-hmm. Now, Bishop Hoyt, you're hearing the same comment coming from Father Coughlin and from Raul, so what, I mean, quickly.
I agree that anybody who sides for the poor is a biblical paradigm. And if that fits in with the understanding of the secular realm, that would give us more impetus to deal with getting in that arena. But I agree that there are some arenas that are so highly explosive until the different religious leaders differ in regards to how you address those, because there's no roadmap in the Bible for that. What we can do is abstract from the Bible and take things that fit our own paradigm, and then we begin to do proof texting, which leads to a construing of the text in the wrong way. So I agree that you're right to say that we have to be careful. But there are different traditions in the Bible. There's the wisdom tradition, there's the prophetic tradition, there's the priestly tradition, there's the understanding of all of these other traditions that somehow some people just make their home in one tradition in the Bible. And therefore they skew the whole Bible and skew their relationship to how they relate to God. And my concern is, I think Imam said it right, that I wouldn't take the Bible out of the hands of people, but I would say that they had to be circumspect in terms of how they interpret the Bible. They can't just make their home in one part of it. Got to deal with all of it.
Diana,
yeah, a lot of conversations going on here, but I guess the thing I'd most like to say is that if you ask where the leadership is coming from, I would say it's not coming from the top in the stratosphere. It's at the local level, all over the country. The growth of what you might call an interfaith movement has happened in cities and towns and suburbs quite without the nourishment of national organizations, because people live together. They come together not to have dialogue around the table in some sort of artificial way, but because they work together, and the workplace is probably the fastest growing site, you might say, of interreligious dialogue and relationship. And in the public schools, and in neighborhoods, and in the libraries, and everywhere where this diverse nation of people actually intermingle and mix and are trying to figure out how to get to know one another in ways that are respectful and don't misconstrue one another's faith. And I think that is happening. And since 9/11, there have probably been the birth of 30 new interfaith councils in places from, Portland, Oregon to Maine, where people have felt the necessity to create a kind of relationship. And when I say dialogue, I don't mean just words. I mean the kind of relationship with neighbors that will sustain us through thick and through thin, but a relationship we actually need to build.
Reverend Isaac, very quickly.
Religious civil rights will be the cutting edge, I think, of the rights movement in the 21st century. Religious civil rights will inevitably be the most important cutting edge of the civil rights movement of the 21st century. It will be. Washington doesn't yet perceive that. The politicians don't always know that. The opinion makers don't see it, but it is, and it will be. It's true internationally, especially Samuel Huntington's book, Conflict of Civilizations, whether you agree with the thesis or not, says that the great conflicts of civilizations rooted in culture and religion will be the contests. Militarily, we've already seen it played out, and it will continue to play out. Now, the United States, my point is, the United States offers an alternative to the world. An incredible example of living with our deepest differences to the rest of the world, to watch and see how we do it. Now, I disagree with Bishop Hoyt on the war, presumably, I'm sure. I'm sure you would disagree with me about the rights of conversion and the rest. But these are critical to be resolved in ways that are salutary as an example to the rest of the world, because they are watching. I see this from evangelical leaders, hear it from them all the time. They say, you may not understand it, but in Ghana, where a presidential candidate runs because of his faith, he got that message from the United States. He got it right or wrong, he decided it was something he should do. That message is going out in millions of ways by our actions or inactions. And so this argument here is really a cutting-edge 21st century kind of talk.
We have very little time left, so I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in quickly.
Well,
hang on a second. We're going to go over here first.
I hear everyone on the I hear everyone on the panel talk about coming together and work instead of just talk, and there's an opportunity for that. I think since 9/11, construction versus destruction. Well, Habitat for Humanity is coming together with both the Interfaith Conference and United Religions Initiative to build for all the religions to come together, for the Sikh with his turban to the with the collar, everyone coming together to build. And what I wanted to ask people on the panel is not only that can you support this, but how can this coming together build? How can that foster what you're speaking of?
I mean, how can religions coming together help to build achievement in terms of reducing poverty, dealing with discrimination against?
Well, not only that, but the coming together of the religions to foster better understanding. Because on the Habitat Worksite, it's an interesting place. First of all, you have an opportunity for people to build. Second, you have an opportunity for people to come together to give back. And when that happens, there's growth. So, like, if the Sikh next to the other religions, they're working together, then they grow together. So that's the thought, and I wanted to hear what y'all's thoughts were.
Well, let me direct it very quickly at the Imam. Or no, go right ahead, Ms. Alkhateeb.
I think that religions can work very closely together. The result of 9/11 and churches and synagogues coming into mosques and saying, we want to help you walk to the store to get food so that people won't hurt you on the way. That was a simple gesture at the beginning, but it turned into something deeper, and it is something deeper now. They're having conversations about homeschooling, how they're doing it, sharing ideas on how to do that, conversations on social justice issues, conversations on how to improve the local hospital. And for instance, in Falls Church, Virginia, in another few months, they're going to have an actual dialogue on race that's being led by a mosque, joined in by 4 churches, and on a completely equal basis to look at the issue of race and trying to draw in, the old ladies and old men who are white middle-class Americans who are afraid of the immigrants, and let the immigrants meet each other, even though they're living right near each other, who never sat together. So I think, yes, they can, and the subject is race. So I think if there's a will, there is a way.
All right, next question.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for such a wonderful dialogue. I participated at a conference in Durban, South Africa, on discrimination on race. And the kinds of conversations that you are conducting were quite similar to those that were raised there. Just my question is, if I may, I think this dialogue is much more powerful than we may sort of think, in that it has huge global implications. For example, the question of globalization and the question of inclusion of people around the globe cannot be understood without this kind of dialogue. And my question is really a practical one. To what extent can this distinguished group of people who have huge influence in academia, in the faith, in religion, in schools, in the communities, to what extent can this group play a role with regard to the UN conference and program of action with regard to the Durban conference on racism, because it has really tremendous significance with regard to what was discussed there and with regard to what has been agreed. But it's only an agreement, and unless it's translated into action, I think we'll be having a conversation on this topic 50 years down the road.
All right, so let me take your question and use it as an opportunity to go around the panel and ask people to draw this thing together, to draw it to a close. Your point seems to be, how can these people who have power and leadership and voice, and who influence so many others, really work to make interfaith dialogue a reality, and not only the dialogue, but works from the hand of God, whatever God you may worship. Let me start at the very end with Jacqueline Johnson.
Well, that is a big challenge, and certainly one for an organization as small and diverse as ours, having to represent all these autonomous tribal governments throughout the country, and bring them together in unity of voice and then moving forward. We were very involved in Durban and trying to deal with the indigenous issues and the indigenous rights issues, continue to do so. And I think that our biggest challenge is to meet with La Raza and other organizations here to be able to educate each other. And that's a commitment I think that you've just challenged us with, and I accept. I think that we need to do that, and it has to start in the small conversations, sitting down, having lunch one with another, looking for opportunities to work together, supporting each other, and then we'll learn and educate about each other, and we will do that. Thank you.
Rabbi Minatoff.
I think we have to make this truly work in the long term, we have to start at home. In a sense, each of us needs to look at our own faith community, our own people, and kind of ask the question, what are the groups out there that we have the most trouble with? Where are the tensions? And we have to start looking at ways to teach our children, first of all, to address those in terms of ourselves, but we need to look for ways to teach our children to deal with these tensions with the most difficult groups we deal with. It's easy when you've got a good relationship with a group. It's much more difficult when communities that have been traditionally, or at least in the recent past, at each other's literally throats, to come to some sort of terms. Where I think it starts, where we need to start making the changes, is with our own children in our schools, in our own religious schools, and in our own study groups with our youngsters. One of the things that I'm very proud of in terms of my group, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, one of our rabbis living in Israel wrote a book called Shalom, Salam, Peace, in English, Arabic, and Hebrew, focusing on what does peace mean. And it wasn't geared for adults, it was geared for children of all backgrounds. We've got to start teaching our children not to hate other people, and not to sort of transfer our negativity about other peoples to our children. We've got to fight that, and that's critical. The second thing that I think is important, and it's come up a lot here from various panelists, is we've got to be project-oriented. The more we talk in these broad terms and we talk about the theory and the theology, that's ultimately not going to lead us anywhere. And if we get too serious about it, it's going to lead us to probably on a destructive path. We've got to look at, and it's been said by a lot of people here, we've got to join together with other religious groups. How do we fight racism? How do we fight poverty? How do we raise the educational level? What about healthcare issues? These are things nationally and locally, these small clergy groups in suburban areas, in the cities, and nationally. We can all work on it, and it's something that in most cases we can agree on. And even in areas where we can't agree, abortion, that's one of the areas that tears us apart. There's no reason why Catholics and Jews who take a very different position on abortion can't sit down at the table and say, how do we work with our people so they passionately articulate their beliefs, and they should. But how do we work with them so they articulate those beliefs without doing violence to other people? That's something we can work on from two very, very different vantage points. So we've got to start with our children, number one, on the difficult issues, and not enforce the stereotypes that we've become ingrained with us. And two, we've got to be project-oriented to change this society and the dynamics in our communities.
Thank you, Rabbi. Sanford Cloud Jr.
I think first we've got to acknowledge that each of us has our own bias and prejudices, even as leaders. And in acknowledging that set of biases and prejudices, be committed to working toward dealing with them so that one can become a more empowered leader as a result, and then lead the kind of change, particularly on social justice issues, that we ought to be pursuing in this new century. Secondly, I think that we've got to be engaged in dialogue, not for dialogue's sake, but dialogue meaning seeking deeper understanding that leads to action. The gentleman who talked about Habitat for Humanity, I think it's critically important that we engage in dialogue with a thought around understanding, but also understanding that leads to improving the quality of life, whether it is, as Paul suggests, in the issue of disparity of health care, or the building of housing, or improving the quality of education for our children. And thirdly, I think as we engage this, I think we have to do it with a mindset of understanding and respect for the other faith communities. I don't think that we can engage in interfaith engagement fully if I'm out trying to convert you. I cannot trust the engagement of your dialogue unless you respect who and what I am. Leave me alone. Allow me to engage what I believe is to be my faith. You know, your faith may suggest that there is a particular way, but let us allow that there may be other ways in order to reach a fullness of life. And in doing so, I think we've got a real opportunity to make this country a better place for all of us.
Reverend Sizer.
I reach out with my hand to your earlier solicitation to dialogue, because obviously we disagree about some things here. But I am committed to that kind of dialogue. I believe, however, that you have to allow the interchange, the spiritual change of hearts, onto the table along with the other issues. It's not because I desire to convert someone. I don't convert anybody. God does that. But I do want the spiritual solutions, the interchanges that occur in people's lives, to be part of the conversation that is real deep. I mean, that to me has to be on the table. It's not my desire to impose, it's not proselytizing, it's part of the conversation that is real. For me to be a part of it, Sanford, that has to be part of it, but I respect your point of view. I would say that we have an unparalleled opportunity. The President has put faith-based initiatives on the table. I don't want government paying for religion. I do want government assisting faith-based groups to do it. Unparalleled opportunities available to us to show the rest of the world what we're all about. And I want to be a part of that and a part of this group in doing those solutions. God bless.
Dr. Singh.
I think we all need to, pat ourselves on the back because, coming from a region which is divided on the basis of religion, being in America, it's a privilege to fully enjoy your freedom and to engage in this kind of dialogue, which is not possible and not available to many people in this planet. In many countries, this is not even possible to have two different religious leaders to come together for a dialogue. So it is a privilege, and I think just to reiterate a word from a Sikh whose 3-year-old boy was attacked with firebomb after September 11 in San Francisco. And when a reporter came and asked him, what do you feel that your 3-year-old child has been hit with a bottle with a fire chemical? He said, I will always enjoy my freedom in America, and I will do it with a turban on my head. And I think that is that underscores the feeling of a lot of people like me who are here. And I agree with my rabbi brother that it is very important that we teach our children. My daughter came to me after school, after September 11. She said, do all Muslims kill people? And I thought of a moment, and then I answered her that Muslims don't kill people. We cannot say that some Muslims or most of the Muslims don't kill people. We will have to say that Muslims don't kill people. And that's the kind of educations we have to give it to our children. And the last thing I would like to say, we will not go further anywhere unless we love each other unconditionally. And unless that happens, we will just not survive as human beings and as a nation and as a world. That loving each other unconditionally, which means that even if we disagree on each other, on many of the belief systems, we still have a divinity hidden in us. And that divinity is present in all of us. And I'll just end with a small prayer from my faith tradition, which I repeated at the White House holding President Bush's hand when he invited us after September 11. The prayer says, Jagat jalanda rakh le apni kirpa tar, jit dware upre tithe leo bar. That, oh Lord, we are in pain because we are separated from you, and we are also in anxiety because we are separated from each other. And accept us, embrace us, and give us your grace, no matter which door I or anybody come to you, whether it's an Islamic door, whether it's a Christian door, whether it's a Hindu door or a Buddhist door or a Sikh door, that God please accept us from whichever door we come to. And that should be, I feel, that is my motto, and that was ultimately the motto of Martin Luther King also. Thank you.
Raul Izaguirre.
The nature of leadership, the nature of our work, is that we pay attention to the urgent and leave the important aside. I think we need to make a commitment to the important, to the real, and I just pledge to all of you here and to others that I'll do my best to pay attention to your call, and I hope you'll pay my attention to my call to focus on the important, and what this is about is important. I thank Sandy and your organization for putting this event on. We've talked a lot about civil rights in this panel, and as we enter the 21st century, we need to remind ourselves that that the nature of that discussion has got to transcend a black and white paradigm. It is much more variegated, it's much more complicated, it is much more rich a conversation if we understand that civil rights is no longer, if it ever was, simply a black and white paradigm. And I say that as somebody who marched with Martin Luther King in 1963, who risked life and limb in Mississippi in '66 and on other occasions. I'm a little bit amazed that we've had this very important discussion without ever mentioning the media. I think it's probably one of the first times a panel of this kind has met and not mentioned the word media at all, Juan, talking about your profession. And I think it's...
I think Reverend Cizik was a media critic. That's why I said I think the whole country is media critics, so have at it. But go right ahead.
I think we need to remind the media that one of its important functions is to educate and to transmit these values and to tell our stories. Much of what we're talking about is bigotry born out of ignorance. And the media can play a very positive role in eradicating that ignorance.
Diana Eck.
Yes, I'd like to go back to our question about the World Conference Against Racism. One thing I think that really brings democracy and dialogue together is that both require our participation in order to succeed. That's what it means to be a citizen, is to participate. And for me, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban was a shameful moment for the United States of America, because we did not sit at that table. We said that there were things that we could not discuss. We couldn't even discuss at the table, much less disagree about. And that, to me, is absolutely against every grain and fiber of my being as a dialogical person. And I think these are the difficult issues in the United States today, too. Where are the tables where, for example, the Anti-Defamation League and the Council on American Islamic Relations will not sit together because ADL has certain ideas about Council on American Islamic Relations that are framed from things that people have said? Where are the tables where Hadassah and the Muslim Women's Council can't sit together? And, exactly. Where are the tables where we cannot even discuss together? And I think this is really a moment where we need to be able to sit at table with people we deeply disagree with and invite Muslims, for example, not simply to participate in the ceremonial events of our national iconography, but to participate in, for instance, the National Commission on Terrorism, where the only Muslim participant was finally withdrawn by protest from people in our society. So I think that they're really difficult dialogical issues, and I think they come precisely out of America's behavior in Durban.
Imam W.D. Muhammad.
Yes. The influence that is behind a mind like Osama bin Laden, it's not coming from our holy book. It's not coming from the leader of Islam, Muhammad the Prophet, who received the revelations. So where it's coming from? It's coming from the things that he have suffered and his people have suffered. He's responding to those things. And it goes all the way back to the days of the Crusades, and then to colonial domination, and on to Israel and the Middle East and the Palestinian conflict, you see. So I think we need to do what the preacher said once. I was with him in a dialogue, and he said, we need to think deep into this thing, talking about 9/11. Yes. It makes me feel very uncomfortable to hear 9/11 mentioned so often, because we know how the press have dealt with that. We know how the White House has dealt with that. So right away a Muslim comes into your face and you see me, you know, when you say 9/11. So that makes me feel very uncomfortable. When we know that Islam did not create that mind, the troubles in the world created that mind. Now, I think we all have the solutions. All of us here have the solutions. I don't disagree with any of you, not at all. I believe that America tends to go to the extreme. When it goes to the extreme. When it goes right, it goes to extreme. When it goes wrong, it goes to extreme. America has a nature to just go to the extreme. Yeah, and I think we need to not have a movement for the poor, but a movement for community. The world has come into one room now. It's not different rooms, and you can't reach me and I can't reach you, or we're separated by oceans. No, we're not separated anymore. We're in one room. And what we need to do is see that this earth is one earth, and the earth is one community. And I'm coming from my religion. I have to come from my religion. God didn't make this to be a home for angels. He made it to be a home for human beings. So we need to keep our focus on what is human nature at its best. And let us work to accommodate human nature at its best on this planet. And we don't have to change you. We don't have to change me. We can stay as we are, and we can compete for souls. And I never intended that we get rid of the Bible from the public. I just intended that you look at the problem and then come up with a solution.
Well, we're not all fools. Some of us got the message. Reverend Daniel Coffin.
There's so much wisdom, and especially from you right now, Imam. I'm really touched by that. And I believe, too, I think this new millennium invites us to look at human nature in an entirely different way. All of us in religion, reformulating maybe some of our, changing our ideas ourselves, changing our willingness to be in dialogue or not to be in dialogue. All that's up for testing, I think, and challenging at this particular time. And I think it may lead to one of the elements of dialogue here. I heard that is credible on both scores, I'd like to say. Some is activistic and get into habitat and other projects, education, health, and so forth. That's very real. That's very real for a lot of people. But I do believe the philosophical questions are also very real for a lot of people, and especially a lot of leaders. And in the end, this is a mentor of mine years ago said this, Dan, in the end, philosophical questions, in the end, are the most practical. So that all while we're in the activities, we need to be, as religion people, bringing meaning to what we're doing, reflecting on what we're doing, and questioning what we're doing, and so that with the spirit renewed, we can be all the more active and more deeply active in some of the reconciling projects that are named here. I have an image that I'd like mostly to respond to your question, is that I was in New Zealand once, and a bishop there put this image to me. He says, Dan, it's not just by accident your country is built up on both coasts. You're a bridge. I was enthused with that idea. I was thinking Europe, and I love Asia, and I was thinking, oh. The more I've thought about it, though, and the more I raise this as a question, we are a bridge. From the new world, the old world to the new world. We pride ourselves on that. Who lives on a bridge? Bridges for trafficking, bridges for business, bridges for movement. And sometimes as Americans, we get so caught up in that we forget our religious roots that make us look for meaning in what we do. And so I keep thinking, we do create great projects here. Our exports and culture, some of those could be questioned, but great projects. But the best thing we have to export is things like the freedom of religion, which is, I believe, also the question of individual rights in the next century. That is not given us by the Constitution, it's protected by the Constitution. It is one of our inalienable rights, and that means it's for the world.
Thank you. Sharifa Alkhateeb.
I think that probably the most important thing for us as a community in the United States to look at is who are we as a human being, and to look at other human beings in their humanity and not to deny any human being their humanity. Not only as individuals, but as a nation, politically. If we are trying to help another nation overcome misery and poverty and the rule of tyrannical, miserable leaders, do we do that by then imposing our idea of what is acceptable and our idea of humanity and our idea of civility and our idea of the right way to dress, the right way to think, the right way to eat, the right way to believe? And whether we are, radical, fundamental, secularist, or radical, fundamental, religionist, both are extremes, and both will not produce the middle way which can continue forward. So we have to stop trying to force each other to come to any particular way of thinking. We have to truly try to see what is the middle ground, what is the middle way, what can go forward from this year to the next year to 10 years down the line. Not that we made a political point and we were able to, get in the paper and we were able to make the statement and we were able to force our way for that few years of time and maybe get elected in an election year, but are we actually trying to benefit humanity? Are we trying to benefit our own families? Are we trying to be someone who is a benefit to our neighborhood, to our schools, to our county, to our state, to the world? And if that isn't what we're really about, whether it's as an individual or a nation, then we'll never reach good goals. We may reach goals, but they won't be good ones.
Thank you very much. Bishop Thomas Hoyt.
Yes, I first want to thank you, Warren, for your fairness in this moderator of this panel, and thank the colleagues for the input. One of the things that I would like to say about the question about Durban and the racism conference is, and you challenge us to talk about our leadership in effecting more dialogue together. Joan Campbell, who used to be the president of, executive director of National Council, was in a dialogue with Phil Potter, who was the World Council of Churches president at one time. And she asked the question, what makes a good leader in the present time? And he said, you must have a screw loose, you must have a death wish, and you must have a sense of humor. And all three of those, he said, people said, well, explain that to us. He said, well, to have a screw loose means that you can't tie things down, you can't screw things down too tightly. You got to leave room for new understandings and be open for the future in a new way. You can't tie it down too tightly. And what I feel that what we've done here is to open up to hear each other in a way that doesn't tie our own traditions down too tightly. Then he said you must have a death wish. What he meant is that we got to be so committed to changes and so committed to what we want to do, see some new humanity until we're willing to even die for it. And that's one thing about the terrorists. They seem to be willing to die for what they believe in. we as Christians are going to have to be just as willing to die, and Christians and Jews and Muslims and Sheiks and whatever, to be so committed to what we somehow see as for humanity that we're willing to even die for it. And that's something that means we've got to be careful what we believe in, but we got to also be willing to see what effect that has on the whole of humanity. And then we've got to have a sense of humor. I mean, we got to laugh at each other and laugh at ourselves and laugh at some of the things that make the demonic angry, because those who are demonic never laugh. We got to have a sense of humor where we can laugh at ourselves and don't wear. My mom used to say, "Don't wear your garments too tightly." You got to have a looseness about some things, and I think we've modeled that today. I saw us laughing at some things, and I heard us laughing, and it makes it good to understand that we can laugh at some of our own ways as well as the ways of others, and begin to move into a new arena. I thank God for this panel, and I pray that what's happening against racism, we're getting ready this weekend to have the Consultation on Church Union will be meeting in Memphis, Tennessee, where we will bring together a celebration of 9 denominations, and they're talking about against racism, and that's one of their main foci, and it's the CME, AME, and AME Zion, predominantly black denominations, along with Presbyterians, Episcopalians, International Community Churches, the United Methodists, Disciples of Christ, and United Church of Christ. All of them are coming together to come together as one body. That's going to be in Memphis, Tennessee, to celebrate Martin Luther King's birth, and all of that is going to take place around this understanding of fighting racism. And I think that that's one of the clear signs of what we're doing. The National Council of Churches has been working with Habitat for Humanities as well to see if we can eradicate poverty. And I think all of that, I commit and pledge to work in that direction and as a future leadership role.
Thank you so much. This has been a really cutting-edge dialogue. From a journalist's point of view, I got to tell you, it's so clear to me in the aftermath of September 11th how important it is for us to have dialogue about constructive steps that the religious community in this country can take to come together to achieve peaceful ends in Dr. King's tradition. In my tradition, the Episcopal Church, I remember last Sunday, the gospel lesson was about the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And at that moment, God looks down and the dove of peace descends, and God says he is pleased with his son. And we can only hope that as all of us have this dialogue and then take the dialogue to the next step of actualizing our sense of what is truly in the tradition of our God, that we can please God through our actions in terms of addressing the reality, the awful reality of racism, of poverty, of need in this society, the problems of violence that we've heard mentioned from the audience. In the civil rights movement, there was a wonderful song. It was called Eyes on the Prize, and it goes, keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. I know the one thing I did right was the day I started to fight, hold on. And for all of us coming from this faith-based tradition, I hope that we hold on and continue the fight, the good fight. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.